There he will meet fellow cadet Lee Harvey Oswald, and there both will fall into the orbit of the freakish David Ferrie, best remembered by his portrayal by actor Joe Pesci in Oliver Stone's film JFK.
There was another Civil Air Patrol unit at Lakefront Airport in New Orleans, and that was a decidedly different Civil Air Patrol unit. The leader of the New Orleans Lakefront Airport Civil Air Patrol unit was a guy named David Ferrie. David Ferrie was a professional airline pilot with Eastern Air, flew for Eastern. One Friday night, Barry called my brother. Now, they were teenagers at the time. They were both in high school, and Barry asked my brother John, said, "Do you want to fly over to Lacombe with me in the morning?" And they left out that morning at 5:30 or 6 o'clock and got to Lacombe probably 30 minutes later. When they landed on the tarmac, my brother saw some interesting things. One was that there were two groups of people out there assembled. One was the Civil Air Patrol unit from Lakefront, and again, this 50 or 60 boys, and they were in formation. The other group was what appeared to be, my brother doesn't speak Spanish, but he understood that they were Spanish-speaking men. They were wearing military fatigues, combat boots, and the distinctive green fatigue cap that soldiers wear. He said there was a very strange-looking man sitting in a director's chair. It was a black folding director's chair, and the man had a .45 caliber pistol strapped to his side in a leather holster. And what was so strange about him was that he appeared to be wearing a complete wig in addition to having strange-looking eyebrows, and he had obviously no body hair. Because my brother didn't know this at the time, but it was David Ferrie, and David Ferrie had a rare skin disorder, and he had no hair on his body. Periodically, Barry would point to the crates, and sometimes David Ferrie would point to the crates. And after about 10 minutes of conversation, Barry came back over to my brother. He says, "John, how'd you like to make about $400 a week?" And to put this in perspective, my dad made about $400 a month, and he was asking my brother if he wanted to make $400 a week. And my brother said, "Well, what, doing what?" He said, "Flying planes with me." As we later discovered, David Ferrie was probably at the time working for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it appears that Barry Seal was working for David Ferrie.
While still an impressionable teenager, both Barry Seal and Lee Harvey Oswald came under the tutelage of a man you wouldn't want your worst enemy's kid to know, David Ferrie, a pedophile and worse.
Oh, he's a real weird guy. Wore a wig, looked like somebody's carpet that he took off the floor and put on his head. It was real strange. He was a real strange guy. Every now and then it would fall off. He'd be talking to you and it would slip, and he was bald-headed. He lived in the quarters, and he held weddings at his house, and just weird things. He'd marry street people, and there was parties, and he was just one of them guys.
Something strange went on in the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol of the middle 1950s. Something which will lead us onward like a trail of breadcrumbs through the signal events of America's secret history in the second half of the 20th century.
The first time you ever heard his name was during one of these joint maneuvers with the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol unit. And the guy was a very popular member of the Civil Air Patrol. His name was Lee. And my brother heard the man's name for the second time in his life. In November 1963, November 22nd to be exact, when it was announced on the TV news that President Kennedy had been assassinated, and that the person that they had taken in custody and charged with the murder was Lee Harvey Oswald, the same man my brother had known as a member of the Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans. It's obvious that David Ferrie, as commander of that Civil Air Patrol unit in New Orleans, was the commander for Lee Harvey Oswald. Probably at the time that these Cuban soldiers were being trained in Lacombe. And it doesn't take a mental giant to put the rest of it together. You just have to figure, well, if Oswald was under Ferrie in the Civil Air Patrol, now here's Oswald being inculpated in connection with the assassination of the President of the United States a few years later. some very strange things were happening in the New Orleans and Baton Rouge areas back then.
The House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to find Oswald and David Ferry's records in the Civil Air Patrol files, but in the first in a sordid series of lost and stolen documents that have kept America's secret history hidden from the American people, they discovered that most of the records of the squadron had been stolen. One record, which escaped being stolen, however, reveals that Oswald joined the Civil Air Patrol on July 27, 1955, while at summer camp with Dave Ferry and Barry Seal. Here we recall how for 40 years Warren Commission apologists have tried to tell us that Oswald and Ferry didn't even know each other. But we didn't have to look any further than the New Orleans Public Library to meet someone who knew different. Colin Hamer was a fellow Civil Air Patrol cadet with Lee Harvey Oswald in David Ferry's squadron.
Lee Harvey Oswald was in my Civil Air Patrol unit. From the summer, sometime in the summer of 1955, I was in recruit class with him.
As it turns out, the feds were interested in David Ferry and Barry Seal long before the Kennedy assassination.
I did speak to the agents of the U.S. Border Patrol about Ferry before the assassination. They seemed to think that he had something to do with getting Carlos Marcello back into the country after he was deported.
They had. David Ferry intimate Alvin Bobuff confirmed to us that he had picked Ferry up at the airport following his return from Guatemala with Marcello. So, just who was this man, David Ferry, who recruited both Barry Seal and Lee Harvey Oswald? Here's another 40-year-old secret revealed. Ferry himself was recruited in 1942 into the CIA's predecessor organization during World War II, which he spent flying undercover missions in South America. Eddie Shearer was in Ferry's Civil Air Patrol outfit before joining the Air Force.
For a long time, starting in about '56, Dave Ferry took over as the senior commander for the cadet squadron. When the cadets drilled, we also had what's called a guide on. One of the guys was playing with it, and it got away from him, and the thing cut his hand in the palm. And that's when I realized that Dave had probably been doing hypnosis with him or some other, because he went to him and had him hold his hand up and then started speaking to him, saying that you'll feel sensation, no pain, the bleeding will stop. And it did. And I also realized from reading about hypnosis that you couldn't do this on your first time. And you don't put somebody under instantly like that within 10 or 15 seconds. But if you have worked with a subject a number of times, they'll go under very quickly.
Even so, it's still a shock to hear the truth casually revealed that David Ferry ran the CIA's Southern Office of Civil Air Transport.
No, I met David in 1965, Lakefront Airport in New Orleans. I was working for Delta. Well, I didn't know anything about him, other than he owned 5 DC-3s that he was flying into the Lakefront Airport. Dave was, he had a little office at Lakefront Airport, and it was like an FBO type thing that didn't do anything but fly. Never saw any passengers. There was pilots working out there. They flew bodies, supposedly, like they had a service where they flew caskets.
5 years after Dave Ferry's untimely suicide on the eve of being called to testify in front of Jim Garrison's grand jury, these same 5 DC-3s were controlled by Barry Seal. Barry Seal's role in the Kennedy assassination was proven to us when we discovered this picture of some of the conspirators taken in a Mexico City nightclub exactly 10 months before JFK was murdered. This photo is the only visual record of the super-secret CIA assassination squad known as Operation 40, active from Mexico City to New Orleans to Dallas. That's Barry Seal, a young-looking 24-year-old. And there's CIA agent and professional assassin Felix Rodriguez, George Bush's great good friend from Iran-Contra, remember? He's the guy who tracked down and killed Che Guevara in Bolivia, and who to this day reportedly keeps Guevara's hand sitting in a jar on his bedroom dresser. And covering his face with his sport coat, that's Frank Sturgis, Watergate burglar, Bay of Pigs operative, and a man who before he died made a written confession of his role in the JFK assassination. And see that dapper guy, front right? Meet the man researchers refer to as the Second Oswald for his role in impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald in order to incriminate the patsy. His name is William Seymour, from the CIA front called the Double Check Corporation, where his job was to recruit pilots like Barry Seal. This picture is an important historical document, a crucial piece of America's secret history. That history, in other words, in which lone gunmen play no role.
Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward.
There are a lot of different landmarks in New Orleans in the Kennedy assassination that I haven't seen very often on films or tapes, like this one behind me. This is the home, while he lived in New Orleans in 1963, of Lee Harvey Oswald. He lived in the back on the other side. What's not generally known about this home is that it may well have been a CIA safe house. Why do I say that? Well, during the time that Lee Oswald lived here, the home was controlled, the apartment rooming house is what it's known as, was controlled by the McClaney brothers, the CIA and mobbed-up Havana casino owners, who also owned the Exile training camp on the far shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Lacombe, from which at least one of the shooter teams is reputed to have come. Mike McClaney was a Meyer Lansky lieutenant and Havana casino owner. And here, across Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans in Lacombe, Louisiana, is where McClaney ran a renegade CIA training camp for assassins. Here are the remains of a place where the CIA trained a secret army which they used not against America's enemies, but against us. This small summer cottage owned by the McClaneys sat beside the training camp. It was being used to store dynamite to be used for bombing Havana. Someone took an 8mm film of this infamous paramilitary camp. On it, investigators for the House Committee on Assassination saw David Ferrie, Lee Harvey Oswald, Guy Bannister, and CIA Mexico City Station Chief David Atlee Phillips immortalized on an 8mm home movie shot in the summer of 1963. Barry Seal, who took 8mm movie footage which we've used extensively in this program, might have taken that film. But then something happened. After the exciting discovery of this film, and while in the custody of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, it was stolen and never recovered. Who has the power to pull a black bag job in our nation's capital on one of the three co-equal branches of the U.S. government? Probably not the Ghostbusters. Here are a couple other places associated with the Kennedy assassination that should also be listed in the National Historical Registry. This famous building symbolizes the CIA mob merger so well that it should have been declared a National Historic Site. Instead, it was torn down, and today is a federal office building. Housed here were Guy Bannister's offices, which served as the war room for the anti-Castro Cuban Revolutionary Council. They all worked here: Guy Bannister, Dave Ferrie, Lee Oswald, Barry Seal. This is also where Barry met mobster Murray Kessler, with whom he will be arrested in 1972. James Miller is the pilot who was arrested with Barry in that 72 bust.
Well, I was aware that Barry had known Murray Kessler since the 60s, at some time, early 60s, and that Murray was one of the ones that we were discussing the overthrow of Cuba with.
And this is Redbird Airfield, just outside Dallas, Texas, where a getaway plane took off unmolested after the assassination. Several hours after the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, in the afternoon of November 22, 1963, an FAA flight controller here at Redbird Airfield saw suspicious activity, which he attempted to report to the FAA. The air traffic controller on duty became suspicious after observing three men in business suits board an aircraft an hour after the killing. When the plane took off on runway 17, he asked the pilot if he needed any assistance, and then asked which way the plane was heading. The pilot stated south.